What is going on, Catella geographers? It's Mr. Majewski. I'm here to run a quick review over the Big Ideas packet covering language and religion. Now, language and religion are part of the culture unit, along with the culture chapter and with the ethnicity chapter. So there are 4 chapters wrapped up into one unit. It's only about 13 to 17% of the test, so you're going to get a couple of questions usually from each of these, maybe 3 or 4 from each. So I'm going to go through these in a video instead of doing it in class so that we can move on to some of the other units I would like for us to review after school. We're going to start on page 32. We're going to go all the way through page 41 today in this video. Make sure that you watch this. Make sure you follow along. Take notes in your packet as you go. If you have any questions, please be sure to ask me. Okay, page 32, the spread of language. So a language, again, remember, is a system of communication. It's based on symbols with agreed upon meanings. And so there's a verbal component to it, and there are some sort of symbols or a system in place that allow you to communicate. Words have meanings or sounds have meanings. A hearth, of course, is where something originates, you know that, and so therefore a language hearth is the place where a language is believed to have been originated. The most common grouping of languages is something called the language family. They are a collection of languages that share a common but distant ancestor. There are many, but the main ones, and there are three big language families. Indo-European is the largest of them all. Sino-Tibetan is next, and then Niger Congo. Indo-European is spread throughout Europe and parts of Asia, especially like Southwest Asia and South Asia. Sino-Tibetan is clustered in East and Southeast Asia. You don't see it, obviously, in Europe. And, of course, by the way, Indo-European is also in North and South America and in Australia because it was brought there by European colonizers. And then Niger Congo is an African series of languages. And that is another major family. There are others. You need to know Afro-Asiatic as well, which is the languages of North Africa, usually associated with Arabic. Anyways, let's get to it. Indo-European is the largest of the language families. It includes English, Hindi, and pretty much almost every European language. It has the most speakers in the world by far. Sino-Tibetan is your second largest family. By the way, this shows you where Indo-European is, and you'll notice it's a worldwide religion. It's everywhere. It's massive. About 50% of all worldwide speakers speak one of these languages. Next up is Sino-Tibetan. That's the second largest. That includes Chinese. We call it Mandarin. It also includes Burmese and other Southeast Asian ones. And then Niger Congo. Niger Congo is located in the southern half of Africa. It's Africa's largest language family. It includes Yoruba, Zulu. Zulu is usually the most common. It has the most number of languages. So again, Indo-European has the most speakers. And especially since a lot of those languages have gone worldwide. Sino-Tibetan has the most native speakers, right? Which means that's their native tongue. That's the language that is their original language. And then Niger Congo has the most languages within its family because it's a mix of all those different tribal and ethnic languages that are all part of the Niger Congo family. There are reasons why language is diffuse, right? There are political reasons, there's economic reasons, there are religious reasons that can help a language to diffuse, sometimes a combination of all of those things. Religiously, for example, the Arabic, which is an Afro-Asiatic language located in North Africa and the Middle East, that was spread largely for religious purposes. If you remember, Muslims, folks that believe in Islam, their religion was transferred in Arabic. That was the original language that it was written into. So to understand the Quran, which is the holy book of Islam, you needed to be able to speak Arabic. There are economic reasons as well. English in particular has spread for economic purposes, first for colonialism and imperialism. And then, of course, tourism, foreign business today. Media is another reason, since so much media is English-speaking. So their languages transfer all the time for economic purposes. Politically, the rise of the British Empire across many different countries and continents, right? Because they were dominant, they brought their language system with them, and places that were under their control, obviously, tended to speak English, like India, like Australia, like Canada, and the later United States. European colonization played a major role with language diffusion. Spanish, particularly in Central and South America, brought by the Spanish Empire. French, which is spoken in Africa, it is spoken in the Caribbean. It is obviously spoken in Eastern Canada, in Quebec, and that had to do with their colonization as well. Also in Asia, right, in Southeast Asia. English, of course, everywhere it seems like, right? It's in North America, clearly. It's even located in some parts of Central America with Belize. It's in the Caribbean, it's in Africa, it's in all parts of Asia. English was really a worldwide language brought by the English Empire. And of course, Portuguese, right, brought to Africa, but most importantly brought to Brazil. So anyways, linguistic geographers aren't just focused on language itself and learning the language. They like to learn the context, the history beyond it, what it is used for, and they like to study the different types of how language is used. For instance, is there a certain language dialect that's spoken in a particular area? Does the language sound the same everywhere, or is it regionalized? Is there a different sort of language that's used at home versus an academic form that's used in school? So all of these are something that a linguistic geographer would be studying. All right, let's get to page number, I believe this is 34, right? Oops, jumped ahead there. Here we go. Love this page. This is a good page, 33. Language patterns today. Well, like we already mentioned, we already defined what a language was, and a language family. Those are the most important, right? There are smaller classifications, right? There's language branches, there's language groups, and then there's individual languages themselves. Remember, a lingua franca is a specific term we use to describe a language that's used by people who don't speak the same language so that they can communicate for trade or business purposes. It's usually the language of the dominant country, all right? It can be a single language. It could even be a mixture of multiple languages. The most common lingua franca today is, in fact, English. It's considered a lingua franca historically because of British colonization, and then more recently, in modern times, because of the rise of technology, computers, and the internet, which is oftentimes in English. Computer programming languages are in English. We see the spread of English films, music, media. American and English-speaking tourists increasingly go around the world. And so what you notice is a lot of English being spoken in places where normally the folks wouldn't use that language, but they do for business or economic purposes. All right. Other major lingua francas, Swahili, if you remember, is used in much of southern and central Africa as a lingua franca. Excuse me. Mandarin Chinese is increasingly viewed as a lingua franca in places in Asia, Southeast Asia in particular, right? Other European languages like Spanish as well, but English is really considered to be the dominant European lingua franca. Maybe Russian in many places in Eastern Europe and Russia as well, historically, because of their control over those areas. Anyways, language families that you need to know, and I do like how they have it on the map as well to show you where they're located. Like I mentioned, Indo-European is the largest. It's the family with the largest number of speakers. It goes all the way from English and German and all of the Romance languages in Southern Europe over to Hindi, which is spoken in India, right? It's the dominant language of the Hindu faith. So it's massive, it's widespread, it's the largest and most widely distributed. And again, we have the most speakers here. Sino-Tibetan, we've already mentioned, the language with the largest amount of native speakers, right? As opposed to just the total number of folks who know it worldwide, but it may not be their first language, as is the case with the Indo-European ones. Afro-Asiatic, remember, is the longest recorded of the language families. Arabic and Hebrew are both Afro-Asiatic. And you'll notice Indo-European spread throughout the world because of colonization and other reasons. Sino-Tibetan is just China and the areas around China, right? So it's just an East and Southeast Asian language. Afro-Asiatic is North Africa here, East Africa, and then the Middle East or Southwest Asia, right? Those are the places where Islam is strongest. And then Niger Congo, remember, is the southern half of Africa. And in between, if you remember, we have many tribal languages that are not part of either of those families. All right, so those are the four biggest, or the four that you really need to know the most out of all languages worldwide. This graph, remember, shows you the percent of languages in each family. Indo-European almost has 50% of all of the languages, right? Sino-Tibetan, 22%. Niger Congo, Afro-Asiatic, much smaller, usually around 6%, give or take. Austronesian, that's the languages of the islands of Southeast Asia. So right next to, Sino-Tibetan, right underneath Sino-Tibetan would be Austronesian on the map. All right, let's get to language convergence and divergence, folks. All right, so convergence is when something comes together. Divergence is when it splits. So we'll start with convergence. Language convergence is when two or more languages come together to form one language that's a mixture of the two. All right, so there's different types of language convergence that occurs. There's the Creolized language. Remember, that's a language that develops from a pidgin and is taught as a first language. So remember, a pidgin, I guess we should start probably there, is a language that combines the vocabulary and grammar from two or more languages so that when people get together to communicate, they have a language that they can communicate in. The moment they leave one another, remember, they go back to speaking their native tongue. So pidgin is only used during that interaction, and it's not a formal language. It's a mix of the two. It's usually a crude version that allows people to be able to get by. All right? Tay boy was used by the French and the Vietnamese in order to communicate with one another when Vietnam was being colonized by the French. Now, when a pidgin language becomes a permanent one that is used as a first language, that is used as a primary language by a group, then it becomes known as a Creolized language. All right? So Creolized is when it's become formalized to the point that it's actually used all the time by one or both groups. An example, remember, Hawaiian, Pidgin, or Creolized English, I guess is how we'll call it, Creolized English. Remember, that's used in Hawaii. Ethnically diverse population, many Hawaiians, Americans, immigrant Chinese, Japanese, Portuguese, and so they use that kind of a bastardized language in order to communicate with one another. Another good example, Tok Pisin, Papua New Guinea, you have a mix of all these different languages, and so they use this Creolized language that originally started as Pidgin between the folks that lived there, called Polynesians, and Europeans that were traveling there. Remember, other terms you need to know, an extinct language is a language that has no more living speakers. Remember, almost half of the world's languages today are on the verge of extinction, so that is something we're desperately trying to preserve before that happens. Language divergent is when a language breaks into different dialects due to being a lack of interaction among speakers. Now, that could be physical barriers like mountains that block languages speakers so that they basically develop their own versions of it, or that could be some sort of cultural barrier as well. That might explain the divergence. And there are different types of language divergence. First off, there's a dialect. A dialect is when you have different versions of language that are based on the same grammar and pronunciation. So grammar, pronunciation are oftentimes going to be changed or modified, even sometimes spelling, in a dialect, because as you speak it differently over time, as generations start to speak slightly different versions of the same language, they'll start to spell words slightly differently as well. So the grammar, the pronunciation, all of that slowly will begin to change when you develop different dialects. For instance, we have different dialects in the United States where words are spelled sometimes slightly differently based on where you are at. So it's not just that we're all speaking the language differently. Sometimes we're using different grammar and pronunciation of words beyond just an accent different. Now, the accent, remember, is just simply pronunciation, right? And that's where it's a little bit different from place to place or between different groups, sometimes not just regionally, but because of wealth or status as well. So dialect is beyond accent, right? Accent is just pronunciation. Dialect is pronunciation plus spelling, grammar, and other slight differences. Remember, an isogloss is a language map. It shows you the boundaries of a word usage. It helps us to determine where dialects begin and end. You can do an isogloss for every word if you'd like, or you can even do an isogloss for a dialect to see how far it extends. It helps language geographers understand where dialects begin and where they end. Now, that is a very kind of quick way through language. There's a lot more to it than that, and I would strongly encourage you to go through your chapter guides at least once from the language unit real quickly, because it's going to fill in some of the gaps on some of the other language families that do exist. So how does language affect the landscape? Well, remember, our cultural landscape is largely affected by language. Cultural landscape, remember, is the imprint left on the natural landscape by the activities of the people that live there or used to live there. So the Great Wall of China, pyramids, homes are all examples of cultural landscape. We're building cultural landscape every day today as well when we build new buildings and modify the environment for our own needs. Most areas are commonly associated with a language or a group of languages in which the people can communicate with each other. And so language oftentimes is clear on the cultural landscape because signs will be in one or more languages. As it's developed and the cultural landscape's developed, the language of that area will have an effect on the landscape, right? If you look at signs for stores, if you look at street signs, if you look at billboards, you'll notice the languages that are being used are a reflection of the cultures that live there. If you go into ethnic neighborhoods, you're going to run into a lot more signs in those particular languages, which will indicate if it's a blended community or not. This linguistic landscapes can be used to send messages. They can be used to send political messages. They could even be, in theory, be used to discriminate or oppress groups as well. Good example is Quebec with the mix of languages. There's a group that's trying to end English-speaking signs. They don't want any signs in English anymore because it's a French-speaking place. It's the official language, and a large amount of the people there are French speakers, and they think it's kind of hurting or slowing down their French identity by having signs in English at the same time. All right. Differences between different areas is pretty clear as well. Oops, I just jumped way ahead. Sorry. What is going on? The way the cultural landscape is altered varies throughout different areas, right? In China, signs are generally in Mandarin Chinese. In America, they're generally in English. This can be confusing to some folks, right? But you got to remember, that's going to be based on the people that live in a particular area, right? So that's just kind of, I guess you could say, expected. Anyways, remember revived languages is another term you need to know. That's a language that has been brought back from extinction, and Hebrew is a great example of that in Israel. Isolated languages, remember, are languages that are physically isolated from others and usually develop separately from all of them. Iceland's a good example of an isolated language. The Basques and the Basque language is a good example because they're not connected or linked in any way to those around them. All right, let's get to religion, and we're going to jump over to page 36, or move over to page 36. Ethnic religions, remember, are a system of beliefs that are specific to a particular group. They're not trying to expand. They're not trying to bring in more converts. You're usually born into the religion. It's usually spread, like most folk things or folk religions, by relocation diffusion. Because you're not actively seeking converts, that's called proselytizing, remember. Then you simply relocate and usually bring your faith with you. That's how it spreads. The majority of religions in the world fall into this category, ethnic or folk religions. Every indigenous religion, for the most part, does. Whether that's in Africa, with Native Americans in North and South America, they are generally ethnic, all right? They're often small. Like I said, they don't seek converts. They place a lot of importance on the native land that they live, and they're very much connected or tied to the land. That's why they're generally not as widespread. Because you need to have a more closeness with a particular area in order to practice it. Examples of ethnic faith: Judaism, Hinduism, Taoism, Shintoism in Japan are all good examples. So Judaism, Hinduism, all of the Eastern faiths for the most part, except Buddhism, are as well. Judaism, remember, is a Semitic language religion. It developed as out of Abraham. It's one of the Abrahamic faiths. It developed in Palestine and Israel. It's one of the oldest religions in the world, and it is the oldest monotheistic faith, which means one God. Remember, their symbol is the Star of David, right? So you'll look for those star on a building in order for you to know that's a Jewish synagogue, which is their house of worship. Their sacred scripture, remember, is the Torah. That is the early books of the Bible, of the Old Testament. They are a monotheistic faith. I mentioned they're an Abrahamic faith. They were founded by a guy named Abraham, who believed God sent. They believed God sent Abraham to the Promised Land, which was Palestine/Israel, in order to found this faith and this culture. Remember, it was actually Moses, who was a later guy that came along. He came along after Abraham, who actually led the Jewish tribes out of Egypt to Israel to settle. Remember, for centuries and centuries and centuries after the diaspora, after the Romans kicked them out, they had no place of their own. They had no homeland. They were spread throughout Europe. They were spread throughout the rest of the world. But the movement to create a Jewish homeland again got hot after World War I and World War II. That's known as Zionism. It's a movement by the Jews to try to recreate Israel, their holy land, in Palestine, on land that didn't technically belong to them, but was given to them after World War II. Anyways, remember the diaspora. That's associated with Judaism. That was the removal of Jews by the Romans, right, during biblical times. And of course, remember, this was because the Jews were rebels and they didn't want to follow Roman polytheistic beliefs. And so they were viewed as troublemakers. They were viewed as rabble-rousers. And so the Romans tried to eliminate the faith and the people by forcing them to leave. That's what the diaspora was. You'll remember as well, Rome finally falls apart, but they had already been kicked out. And then, of course, many of them are in Europe. They're persecuted. They're forced to live in ghettos in many European cities. And then, of course, the worst example is the Nazis in World War II, who persecuted Jews and blamed them for a lot of the world troubles, and millions were exterminated. The Jewish house of worship is called temple. It's technically known as a synagogue, S-Y-N, A-G-O-G-U-E, so synagogue. There are 15 million worshippers worldwide. Most are in Israel or the United States. The remainder, for the most part, are in Europe. The sacred sites, Israel, obviously, and Jerusalem specifically is the holy city. Of course, that is the site of nearly all of the most important Jewish religious traditions. Another famous ethnic faith is Hinduism. That obviously was founded in India in what's called the Indic hearth. If you remember, their symbol is the Aum. And it looks kind of, if you ask me, like a Roman numeral 30, right, with a little umlaut over it. Anyways, their sacred scripture, if you remember, is called the Vedas, I should say. They are a polytheistic faith, so that's a big difference between them and Judaism. They're the oldest known faith that's still around, and they are polytheistic as well. There are different branches of Hinduism, if you remember. There's the Vedic branch, where you follow the original writings of the Veda texts. Karma is a big part of the Hindu faith. Remember, positive or negative influence of deeds upon your reincarnation. Remember, they're big believers in reincarnation. They believe it's a cycle. And how you live your life. If you live it positive and spiritual, you're going to be reincarnated in a higher class. If you live a negative life or a bad life, you're going to be reincarnated in a lower one. Remember, it's a cycle, and the goal is to get enough positive karma, right? So, positive vibes to reach moksha. Moksha is eternal bliss, so that's what all Hindus are trying to reach. That can only be done by a series of reincarnations that gets you to that afterlife. Remember, Hindu faith is based very strictly on the caste system, or the caste system. There was a social system in India based on reincarnation, where the karma of your past life controlled what caste or caste you were in. Remember, there were 5 levels, right? And of course, the untouchables were the folks at the very, very bottom. They were the ones who had the lowest castes. And of course, the further that you went up, the more you got into like the religious and political leader caste. Which generally meant that you were closer to moksha, you were closer to the afterlife. Remember, it was very strict in India for many, many centuries, where people in different levels could not marry, they weren't supposed to interact, you had certain jobs based on what level you were in, so all of this mattered tremendously. The Hindu religious house of worship is known as a temple. Now, there are over a billion worshippers. Almost all of them are in India. Because it's such a massive populated country. All the other ones, most Hindus are pretty evenly spread out in the United States, or they are in the countries right around India, like Nepal and Bangladesh. Alrighty, so again, It's an ethnic faith. It's clustered in India with nearly all of its worshippers. Almost all of its religious sites are in India. They are in India, and they're usually always natural or physical bodies of water. The most famous is the river Ganges. Remember, Hindus are supposed to make a pilgrimage there and bathe in the river at some point in their lives. Universalizing faiths are the other end of the spectrum, all right? They are a belief system that's worldwide in scope. It welcomes all people. It actively tries to convert people to become adherents, which means followers. And they're going to send missionaries or do other activities to try to encourage people to join. There are three major universalizing faiths you need to be familiar with. The first is the Buddhist faith. They are considered, there's different branches of it, quite frankly, but they don't have a creation story, all right? They don't have what they call the Cosmogony, which is an explanation for how the world was created. It's more of a way of life. It's more of a balance or an inner peace sort of thing. It was founded about 2,500 years ago, so thousands of years after Hinduism, but about, thousands of years before Judaism popped up, too. It's founded in northern India, just like Hinduism was. Remember, it's founded by a guy named Siddhartha Gautama. He was a Hindu prince. He was completely sheltered from suffering and pain. And he was troubled by this, so he decided to renounce it all. He left all of his wealth, and he traveled around in order to try to become the Buddha or the Enlightened One. And of course, the key here was, sacrifice and pain and suffering in order to achieve none of these things in the afterlife. So it spreads to Southeast Asia. It spreads to East Asia from its hearth. Interestingly enough, most of the folks in its hearth area today are no longer Buddhist. They're Hindu. But this actually spreads throughout all of the rest of Asia and becomes much more popular in East Asia and Southeast Asia than it does in where it originated, South Asia. 500 million followers, China, Japan, Thailand are great examples. Why did it spread? Well, if you remember, it spread largely because of trade. The traders, the merchants, brought it with them to Japan and to China, and it became popular there. So it's really popular in East and Southeast Asia. Also, traveling teachers. Teachers would go around and they would educate a lot of the higher classes in many of these areas, and they would oftentimes bring it with them and spread it that way. There are three branches, right? Remember, there's the Theravada and the Mahayana. The Theravada is considered more strict, more literal, right? That's more about the pain and suffering. Mahayana is generally considered to be more easy to practice. It's more positive. The way that I usually describe it is that's the one where, like, that would be popular in the United States with people that do a lot of prayer and meditation, yoga, those sorts of things. And then there's Tantrayana, which is way less known and really, really radical compared to the other two. And so it's kind of its own little version that really focuses on finding your inner soul in everything that you do. Major beliefs of Buddhism, no matter what branch you are, is that nirvana exists, and that's the circle of life and death, right? Remember, there are four noble truths that everybody is supposed to follow, and an eightfold path in order to reach nirvana and reach those noble truths. And remember, these things are simple. It's like, seek the truth, right? Be kind, give to charity, right? Achieve a balance. So 4 truths, eightfold path to spiritual enlightenment. They too call their house of worship the temple, and of course they have like the ship wheel, the steering wheel, I guess you could say, which is supposed to be like a compass, which allows a person to maintain their bearing in life, maintain balance, and all of those good things. Then we have, if you recall, we have Christianity. That is an Abrahamic faith, right? That's monotheistic. That was founded around 33, really around 0 BC, right around the birth of Christ. It was founded in Palestine. It was founded by a guy named Jesus Christ. He was a Jew, but he spent his life teaching and spreading the ideas of Christianity. It spreads to Europe, and then it spread to European colonies as well. It has about 1.5 billion followers today. The United States, Brazil, Mexico, all great examples. Almost all of Europe is as well. Remember, there are divisions. There's the Catholics, which are generally located in Southern Europe and Eastern. There are the Protestants, who are generally located in Northern and Western Europe, right? And then there are the Orthodox Christians, who are located in Russia and other portions of Eastern Europe as well. Of course, you know that Catholics believe in the Trinity, right? The Father, the Son, and the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost. However, Christians do not. They just give significance to God and to Jesus, His Son, according to their beliefs. The sacred text is the Bible, right? It's the New Testament for the most part. The church is their house of worship. And of course, the crucifix or the cross is their religious symbol. Finally, we have Islam. Islam is also an Abrahamic faith. Remember, Islam, Christianity both develop out of Judaism, and so they're all based off of the same founder, Abraham. It's the most recent of the Universalizing Faiths. It was founded 1,500 years ago. It was founded in Mecca in Saudi Arabia. It was founded by the Prophet Muhammad, if you remember. And of course, remember, he was meditating and he received revelations from God. He called him Allah via an angel named Jibril. And he spread these teachings, these ideas that were given to him. Remember that Muslims feel like Jesus is a prophet, just not the prophet, right? Not the actual founder, not the Messiah. This religion spreads very quickly. It spread through North Africa and Southeast Asia, including Indonesia, which is actually the largest Muslim country in the world today. It has 1.6 billion followers worldwide. Indonesia, Pakistan, India have a large number of Muslims. Remember, there's a lot of conflict between Muslims and Hindus in India. Pakistan is a Muslim country. About 60% of Muslims are actually in South and Southeast Asia. Remember, there are two main branches, Sunni and Shia. Almost all Muslims are Sunni, 80%, only 15 are Shiite. Remember, Iran is the center of the Shiite faith, right? Pretty much everybody else is Sunni. I'd say Saudi Arabia is probably considered the center of the Sunni faith. The only difference, remember, is who can be the leaders, spiritual leaders. Shiites believe they should come directly as descendants from Muhammad. Sunnis argue that that should not be required. All right. If you remember, the Islamic faith is based on 5 pillars, right? There's faith, there's prayer 5 times a day, right? There's the promise to give alms to the needy. You give a tithe, about 1 to 2% of your wealth, to the church. You got to fast during Ramadan. You got to make a pilgrimage to Mecca at some point in your life as well. Ramadan, remember, is the religious holiday. If you remember, the Quran is their sacred text. They have mosques as their houses of worship. Remember, mosques usually are domed. They have the minarets, which are the towers that are lit around them. If you remember, the symbol of Islam is the moon and the star, because those are what showed Muhammad the way when he was in the desert, when he first discovered the faith. All right, the spread of religion. Remember, out of the Indic hearth, we're going to get Hinduism, Buddhism, and Sikhism, because they all really developed in India. Sikhism is a newer version. Of course, Hinduism, as you know, has spread throughout India, through the Ganges River Valley. It's not really practiced that much outside of India because of its ethnic faith status. Buddhism, if you remember, was founded in India as well. It spreads out into Southeast Asia and China. It is a universalizing faith. Again, spreads largely because of trade, not only sailors, but also along what's called the Silk Road, which was a trade route that connected Asia to the Middle East and Europe. And then, of course, Sikhism is more recent, right? It's a universalizing religion as well, though not very widespread. Sikhs are similar in terms of Hindus. They have some Hindu beliefs. They have some Buddhist beliefs. It's kind of like an amalgamation. It's kind of like a mix of different beliefs in that area. And then out of the Semitic hearth, right, out of the Abrahamic hearth, we get Judaism, Christianity, Islam. We already know Judaism originates in Israel. It's moved away from there during the diaspora. It's moved back since World War II. And of course, the country of Israel, very strong today. A close close ally of the United States is Israel. Christianity, founded in Palestine, spread by contagious and then hierarchical diffusion. Remember, Islam spreads largely because of warfare, right, and conquest. It spreads hierarchically as well as leaders adopted it and forced their peeps to as well. Christianity spread originally contagiously because of missionaries who went out after Jesus' death and spread it from small town to small town. And then eventually the Roman Empire, the emperor converted over, Augustine, and when he did, he ordered the entire Roman Empire to do the same. So that's why it spreads Christianity throughout much of Europe when it does. It is today found worldwide. Europe, South America, North America, Australia, Sub-Saharan Africa as well. Sub-Saharan Africa is Christian generally. All right, Christian or animist, whereas North Africa is mostly Islam. All right. Okay, let's go to 39. 39, fundamentalism versus secularism. Fundamentalism is where religion is such a fundamental part of your life that it really guides your behavior. Secularism, remember, is where you are not religious or you are a full-fledged atheist. Fundamentalists, remember, have a very strict interpretation of faith that controls all aspects of life. They reject modernism. They believe in traditional views, traditional approaches, oftentimes traditions that are associated with the Bible or their religious text. They believe that states' policies and laws and religion should be connected, that a lot of our policies, our laws, should be based upon religious principles or ideas. These would be folks that would argue we have a long tradition of Christianity, and so that our laws should reflect that Christian tradition. It's not very common, fundamentalism in westernized places, in modern places. It's less common in the cities than it is rural places. The more developed you are, usually the less fundamentalist you are as well in terms of countries. They want to uphold very strict religious traditions. They live by those strict traditions and interpretations. They do not like to see drastic change as what they consider to be insulting or disrespectful to their faith. Examples of fundamentalists would be terrorist groups in certain places in the Middle East. For instance, the Taliban in Afghanistan, which is Central Asia. Also ISIS in the Middle East. They have tried to create countries or governments that follow something called Sharia law, which is based on the Quran, and punishments are determined based off of the book. So, for instance, if you steal, you might end up losing a limb, right? Because that's what the Quran says should be the punishment. Also, some fundamentalists in the United States, they want to ban things like teaching evolution, all right, because they think it's violation of their creationist beliefs. And so that would be a fundamentalist thing where for religious reasons, you're trying to use your government or your laws in support of your religion or against those that your religion doesn't prefer. Blue laws, or what sometimes are called dry laws, are where certain businesses will be closed potentially on Sundays or other religious days, or where alcohol will be restricted because of religious traditions like, Sunday for church. And so in many southern states, they don't allow you to sell alcohol on those days. Secularism, remember, is something very different. Secularism is a belief that religion and government should not be connected. You can either be not religious or you can just think religion's not that important and not that necessary. This usually means a religion has less of an impact on your life. Oftentimes, secularists are also called modernists because they have a more modern view of how the world is developing. They believe we should focus on the future and instead of holding on to traditions from the past. Secularism is popular in westernized and developed places. It's less popular where there is less development. And secularists think that religious rules and ideas should be flexible to fit modern societies and that you really shouldn't choose any religious ideas over any other, and that we really should just try to eliminate religion from our everyday decision-making politically and socially. Those who believe in separation of church and state without any sort of change or deviation would be considered secularist. People in Europe, specifically France, who have supported bans on burqas and other Islamic clothing, would be secular. They want to see all signs of religion kind of removed as much as possible. Religious patterns today. Where are major religions located today? Well, Buddhism, remember, tends to be located in China, Southeast Asia, Japan, and Korea, and we've talked about the reasons how it got there. It's a syncretic faith, so it blends in well with all of the other local ethnic faiths there, like Taoism, Shintoism. And it doesn't have a creation story, so it's more of a way of living, right, and achieving that balance, that peace in your life. So it's very strong in Asia, particularly East and Southeast Asia. Christianity is a worldwide faith, right? Obviously North and South America, obviously almost all of Europe, obviously Southern Africa, under Sub-Saharan Africa, and Australia as well. And again, that has historic reasons, and it has reasons today why it is so popular. Islam, remember, is very strong in North Africa, the Middle East, and Central Asia. It's also popular, if you remember, in Indonesia down here as well. And so it is very widespread. It's the fastest growing religion that is out there. Sikhism is really popular in northern India. Alrighty, so I told you it's kind of a blend of Buddhism and Hinduist ideas, mixed in with some other beliefs like Islam. And therefore it's located right in the border where all those religions kind of come together. And then Hinduism is popular in India, also Nepal, Bangladesh, to a lesser extent, and even Mauritius, right, which is over in Africa. And then Judaism is popular in Israel. It's popular in the United States, a little bit of Europe as well. We got some key facts down here for you. 8 in 10 people affiliate with one of these big, universalizing faiths. Hindus, Christians, Muslims tend to live where they are in the majority, right? So they tend to like to cluster together and live together. Christians tend to be the most equally dispersed all over the world. They're not as clustered as other religions. Some religions have younger populations. Islam tends to. When it comes to other information, Buddhism is largely associated with the Asia-Pacific region. Christianity is associated with Europe, right? Islam associated with the Asian-Pacific region. Hinduism associated with South Asia, right? And of course, Sikhism, Judaism, smaller religions in terms of total numbers of practitioners. Religion and the cultural landscape. Again, evidence of human activity and culture on the environment. Religion has a tremendous impact on the cultural landscape. First, through sacred sites. Those are places that have religious significance to a particular culture. Also, and those could be anything from like burial sites, right? Those could be important sites where the religion was founded. Housing, and your house of worship and the way that it's set up, the way that it's structured, how large it is. All of those are signs of your cultural landscape. Your places of worship, again, reflects your religious landscape. And symbols and icons as well are used to identify or label your religious landscape as well. So again, Christianity, sacred site is Israel, place of worship is the church, the symbol is the cross. Remember, the church is kind of an area for communal gathering where everybody gets together to communally gather and worship together. And yes, most of the holiest sites in Christianity, again, are located in Israel, in Jerusalem, since that's where the faith developed. Islam, remember, its sacred sites are Mecca and Medina in Saudi Arabia. Its place of worship is the mosque, remember, and of course the domed structure that we see. Remember, both Christianity and Islam liked for their houses of worship to be massive and large and dominate the scene, so that peeps could see them from far away, and that the size and the power of the houses of worship would be a reflection of the faith itself. Buddhism, remember, its sacred sites usually are associated with the lives of Buddha. So some of the most important sites in India and Nepal, where he made his most famous discoveries. Things like a place called Bodh Gaya. And the symbol, as you know, is kind of the wagon wheel there. Alrighty. Judaism, right? Israel's our sacred site. Synagogues are our house of worship. We already know that. Hinduism, all of the key sites in Hinduism are located in India. And again, many of them are in or alongside rivers and other bodies of fresh water. And Sikhism, of course, by the way, the Sikhist symbol looks like that. And their holy sites as well are in northern India. All right, so I think we might have one more page. No, we don't. That's it. We're ending it there. Folks, Mr. M signing off. Hopefully this helps you. Hopefully you're reviewing on your own. Get to it.